Good afternoon, TaxTron users. This is another video, a follow-up video for tuition transfer, except this time the transfer is from a taxpayer to a spouse. Now, as I mentioned, this is a follow-up video for a previous tuition transfer video, which was the tuition transfer from a dependent to a parent. Some examples of the things we looked at in the previous video are the maximum tuition transfer at the federal and provincial level, the criteria for tuition transfer, which is a very, very important one, and the calculation for determining the max transferable amounts. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into the subject. So the first thing we're going to look at is a list of the forms that we're going to use. Now, the ones highlighted in red, these top 6, are the forms that we've already looked at in the other previous video. We're still going to open these forms highlighted in red, but since we've already explained it, we're not going to do much explaining again. But if I could turn your attention to these two new forms, the Schedule 2 and the Provincial Schedule 2, these are the two new forms we're going to look at today. We'll explain a little bit more about these forms in the demo, but one more thing, for the spousal transfer, the family work chart isn't needed, so we're going to go ahead and delete this from the forms used. Okay, so we have two returns here, both husband and wife. Husband's name is Jack, the wife's name is Jill. Both are linked and both have some income. Jack has income of about $40,000 working from TaxTron Tax, and Jill was the part-time student. She worked at TaxTron Tax also, made about $16,000, and incurred about $8,000 in tuition fees. Now the first step is to enter any sort of information on the T2202 of the wife's return. We're going to say Jill is going to be transferring some tuition to her husband. So we open the T2202 and we're going to enter the applicable information. So from the University of Toronto, she went to school. Once again, I highly, highly recommend you watch our first video because that will explain this form in a little bit more detail. Now, if we scroll down to the bottom, we see two checkmark boxes. Okay, so for the first checkmark box, we're going to checkmark the transfer the maximum amount. And if you can see here in the two boxes, we have the federal amount designated for transfer maximum, slightly over $2,000, and the provincial amount designated for transfer is about $1,300. Now, I cannot stress enough that the biggest criteria for transfer is that the spouse, in this case Jill, must use up all her tuition on her return to reduce the tax liability to zero before the transfer can take place. And once again, this aspect is covered in a lot more detail in our first video. Now for the second checkmark box, this box is a little bit more important. Now, the simplest way to think about the second checkmark box is that checkmark it if it's a student transferring to a parent. Do not checkmark if it's a spousal transfer. In this case, Jack and Jill are married, so we would leave this checkmark blank. Now, we're going to open a lot of similar forms that we did in our previous video. The first is going to be our Schedule 11, our tuition transfer form. Again, we go into much more detail explaining the calculation, but for now we're just going to scroll to the bottom and underline 327. We're going to see the federal amount transferred. Same thing will be for the provincial Schedule 11. We type down PS11 to the form manager, we open it up, and we can see down at the very bottom, line 5920, we see about $1,300 transferred. Now we're finished with the wife's return, entered all the applicable information, we're going to go back up to the husband's return. Okay, now we're going to go back to the husband's return and we're going to take a look at the two new forms. The first one we're going to look at is the S2, or the Schedule 2. We're just going to type down S2 into the form manager. Now this form is essentially for any sort of spousal transfer amounts. This can include pension income amounts or disability amounts transferred from a spouse to a taxpayer. Now the line of interest on the S2 for the husband is the line 360, where we can clearly see that our $2,000 from Jill, from her Schedule 11, once again her $2,000 has been transferred to Jack's return. Now the second form is essentially exactly the same as the Schedule 2, except it's called the PS Schedule 2, or the Provincial Schedule 2. Now this is for transfer amounts at the provincial level. Going back to our first video, there are different maximum transfers at the federal and provincial level. But we can see on line 5,909, we see the $1,300 transferred from Jill's return. So, now, where do we see these two transferred tuition amounts on the husband's return? Well, we're going to take a look at the Schedule 1. The amount should automatically flow. Now, if we type down Schedule 1, we can see, if we scroll down, on line 326, we can see the amounts transferred from a spouse or common law partner. Since the only thing that was transferred was tuition, the federal amount is going to show up here. As is the same with the provincial amount. Because our couple is in Ontario, we're going to access the Ontario 428, that's the provincial tax form, and we'll see the same thing. We'll see the $1,300 transferred, line 5,864. So that is everything. It's a little bit easier than the transfer from the dependent to the parent. Instead of, as I mentioned before, the family work chart isn't used, so the amount will automatically flow to the taxpayer Schedule 1. In the previous video, we had to enter the transfer amount manually into the family work chart. So it's a little bit easier, only 2 new forms used. And that is everything. Thank you for tuning in to Tax Tip Tuesdays.